edit that out. Okay, hi everybody. Thank you for joining us for our next session at the EdInnovate Showcase. And I'm really happy to welcome our dear friends, Gregg Behr and Ryan Rydzewski. And Gregg, am I pronouncing your last name correctly?
My name,
Behr?
yes, sounds like the animal, and Ryan's is Rydzewski. That's so funny.
No, it isn't.
I think I got Ryan.
You got real close, Lisa. It's Rydzewski.
Rydzewski.
Yep.
Yeah, super happy to have you guys here. Just as a little background, and I'm going to introduce your session just to welcome you both with the Grable Foundation, and Gregg is the executive director, founder of Remake Learning Days across America. How many cities were we in this year with Remake?
Here, there were 17 cities across the United States. 17
cities hosting amazing events for kids, family, community, just to showcase what's happening that's great in education. And now the two of you have an amazing book out, which I'm assuming will be part of what the talk is today. And so if I could just introduce your session, which I love the description. That's why I wanted to read it. Fred Rogers was more than a nice guy in a sweater. He was also a learning scientist who was decades ahead of his time. And so in this session, Gregg and Ryan, authors of When You Wonder You're Learning, Mr. Rogers' Enduring Lessons for Raising Creative, Curious, and Caring Kids. And then together we're going to explore how Fred engineered Mr. Rogers' neighborhoods to develop the tools for learning, and which is an amazing way to think about Mr. Rogers. So welcome, Gregg and Ryan. We're going to turn it over to you for up to 30 minutes, and then we've got 10 to 15 minutes for open discussion and questions. And I am going to mute camera for now.
Well, thank you. Thanks to Lisa. Thanks to the Jacobs Institute for having us. And thank you to all of you who put this together and all of your sessions. We're really happy to be here. We are going to talk really fast, so I'm just going to say that up front. We're going to try to squeeze a 45-minute talk into 30 minutes, and I think we can do it. But we have to start somewhere. So let's start with this guy. If you know who this is, you probably grew up watching TV between 1968 and 2001, when Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood was on the air. It was an iconic children's television program. If you didn't grow up watching Fred, if you're not familiar with the neighborhood, that's okay. We'll come back to it. But if you're familiar with Fred, if you're familiar with Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, I want you to take just 1 second to think about what that experience was like. What's one word or one phrase that comes to mind when you think about watching Mr. Rogers? And you can just put it in the chat. Kind, absolutely. Warmth, yes.
Ryan, as we're seeing these words come in, many of you remember Fred Rogers in the most emotional, wonderful ways possible. And you remember how he made you feel accepted, special, and safe. You might also remember his favorite number, 143, which was his code for I love you. There's 1 letter in I, 4 letters in love, and 3 letters in you. Fred and his television program helped millions of kids to feel loved. And in this next slide, you're looking at 2 of them. And we're here with you today. I'm Gregg Behr, as Lisa said. I'm executive director of the Grable Foundation and also co-chair for an educational ecosystem we call Remake Learning. We'll come back to that.
And my name is Ryan Rydzewski. I am a science and education reporter and also a former teacher. I taught 4th and 5th grade in Louisiana. But all you really need to know about Gregg and I is that we are children of Western Pennsylvania. So like Fred Rogers himself, we were born here. We moved to different parts of the country for a while, and eventually we found our respective ways home. So although Fred was, of course, a national celebrity, here in Pittsburgh, here in Western Pennsylvania, he felt like he was ours because he really was our neighbor. And so we grew up with this deep emotional connection to Fred that I know lots of you probably share. Fred had this amazing ability to connect with people through television. And even today, almost 20 years after Fred himself passed away, his impact is still being felt.
And last April, after 3 years of research and lots of drafts, we published When You Wonder You're Learning. It's our book about Fred's enduring lessons and why they still matter today. And along the way, we learned a few things about Fred, 14.3 to be exact, 143. And we think after spending some time with us in the neighborhood today, you'll see why we're just as wide-eyed now about Fred as we were when we were kids, but maybe not for the reasons that you think.
Lesson number 1, Fred Rogers was not a saint. So without exception, the first question Gregg and I get when we talk about this book is, was Fred really like that? And of course, what people mean when they ask that question is, no human being could possibly be so nice all the time. There's got to be a dark side. There's got to be a secret that could shatter the myth of Mr. Rogers. But as Greg and I discovered, Fred was exactly who we needed him to be. Now, that's different from saying he was perfect, because he wasn't. Fred got angry. Fred made mistakes. Fred Rogers was not a saint. But we didn't need Fred to be a saint. You know, what's more useful and what we got in Mr. Rogers was just a regular person. Someone who, despite all the flaws that come with being a human, committed himself to being the person that children needed him to be every day of his life. The Fred that we saw on screen wasn't a saint, but it wasn't an act either. It was a practice. It was the result of Fred's daily choices and his careful methods. And without a doubt, the biggest honor of writing this book is having a foreword from Fred's late wife, Joanne. It's one of the last things she wrote before she died. And in it, Joanne writes, "No one worked harder at being Fred Rogers than Fred Rogers himself." So who was Fred Rogers, and who was he working so hard to become?
Well, he was more than a nice guy in a beautiful cardigan. Fred was born in 1928 in a town called Latrobe, Pennsylvania, just to the east of Pittsburgh, where Ryan and I are located right now. Now, we're not going to go too deeply into Fred's background. Maybe some of you have seen the recent Tom Hanks film. Maybe you saw Morgan Neville's amazing documentary. But there are a couple things that you should know if you want to understand Fred's neighborhood. And the first is this, that Fred actually hated television when he first encountered it. The first thing he ever saw was this, people throwing pies in each other's faces. And he hated seeing this technology being used to demean other human beings in this way. But at the same time, he saw the technology's potential. And he decided, as he enrolled at the Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, that he wanted to use this technology to minister to children, as he said. And his teachers at the seminary said, well, if you're going to do that, you better learn something about child development theory and practice. And that's how he ended up at a place called the Arsenal Children's Center right here in Pittsburgh. And this is where the story gets completely interesting, because it was at Arsenal that some of the world's most brilliant psychologists and pediatricians and psychiatrists in all of the world happened to be working at the same time, right in this little center in the overlooked city of Pittsburgh. You see, there are folks like Benjamin Spock, the doctor whose book Baby and Childcare remains one of the best-selling books of all time. There was Eric Erikson, the world-renowned psychologist. And most importantly, there was Margaret McFarland, a psychiatry professor who became Rogers' lifelong mentor and dear friend. So you see, studying at Arsenal put Fred at the absolute cutting edge of child development science in the 20th century. And he took what he learned there from these extraordinary people, and he blended it with original stories and songs, puppetry, building what eventually became Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Every aspect of Fred's program, from his words to his wardrobe to this physical set itself, was grounded in science. It's an incredibly overlooked part of Fred's legacy. But Fred was way more than a nice guy in a sweater. He's what today we'd call a learning scientist. And in so many ways, he was a learning scientist who was decades ahead of his time.
Right. So today we know more than we ever have about how humans learn, right? As a field, the science of learning includes everything from behavioral science to artificial intelligence, economics, and more. There are people and organizations and places like the Jacobs Institute doing amazing work to figure out the methods and the conditions that are most conducive to learning. And what's really fascinating about so much of this stuff is the degree to which it validates what Fred was doing a half century ago, right here in Pittsburgh. So take the title of our book, When You Wonder, You're Learning. You can see some of the lyrics here on the left. Did you know it's all right to wonder? You can ask a lot of questions about the world. Did you know when you wonder, you're learning? Now compare those lyrics to this quote from a research paper on the right from the University of California at Davis. It says, curiosity may put the brain in a state that allows it to learn and return any kind of information, like a vortex that sucks in what you're motivated to learn and also everything around it. In other words, when you're curious, your brain turns on, starts to take in information. Mr. Rogers was right. When you wonder, you're learning. And as you can see here, that research paper came out in 2014. Fred wrote Did You Know in 1979. We could spend all day talking about the ways in which learning science is just now catching up to Fred. But the bottom line is this. Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, if we want it to be, can be more than a pleasant memory in the minds of us, the adults. It's also a blueprint. It's a resource. It's something that if we study, can help point the way forward for kids and learning. So today, in the little bit of time we have left, we're going to tell you a little bit about why Fred did what he did. We're going to talk about how Fred did it. And we're going to talk about what it can look like when caring adults around the country use Fred's blueprints to build learning spaces where every kid can thrive. And we use that term specifically, learning spaces. We use that intentionally because, as Gregg will tell you,
Fred knew that learning happens everywhere. In the chat, maybe cite a place that you went with Fred in that magical experience of watching the neighborhood. Because you remember, we were in his living room, but we were also at the library, we were in the museum go around, we were at the bakery, we went to crayon factories. The list goes on and on. The point being that Mr. Rogers built a neighborhood. He knew that classrooms and schools were critical, but he knew that they're just part of a learning landscape, a landscape in which learning happens everywhere. And part of the reason that Ryan and I wrote this book is because for the last 15 years, we've been building a landscape like that in Fred's backyard of Southwestern Pennsylvania. You see, in our corner of the world, Remake Learning is a professional network of educators in and out of school, early childhood through higher education, who are working together to reimagine learning. It's a network that involves thousands of people representing more than 600 organizations, schools, museums, libraries, early learning centers, after-school programs, creative industries, college campuses, the list goes on. All of these organizations are working together to create more engaging, more relevant, and more equitable learning opportunities for our young people, whom you all know are navigating times of rapid technological and social change. And because Remake Learning is situated right here in Western Pennsylvania, we often say that the educators involved in Remake Learning use the Fred method, referring, of course, to Fred Rogers. And when we say that, we mean that they're going about their work as Fred did. They're connecting whole child frameworks with what we're learning about learning itself. Think of it like a simple equation. Whole child plus learning sciences equals the Fred method. In so many ways, our book springs forth from this incredible learning landscape that we call Remake Learning. You can see, go ahead, Ryan.
oh, okay. So all these folks involved in Remake Learning are doing a version of what Fred did. They're teaching what Fred called his tools for learning. Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, of course, was an educational television program, but Fred never focused on things like fractions or spelling words. Instead, he focused on things like curiosity. He focused on things like creativity. He focused on all these things that he called his tools for learning. He said, I would rather give children the tools for learning. If we give them the tools, then they'll want to learn the facts. And more importantly, they'll use the facts to build and not destroy. Fred knew that academic learning has to be paired with a nurturing of what's best in us, that one without the other is insufficient. And here again, learning science is proving Fred right.
In fact, Fred's tools might be more important now than they were back then. And we hear it from scientists, parents, employers, and just about everyone else who now say that Fred's tools are essential to children's success, especially in this age defined by algorithms and increasingly smart machines. Now, one of the most amazing examples of this comes from a company that you all know well, the Google. So a few years back, the company tried to figure out what makes for a good boss at this company. And for a long time, they assumed, well, we have the best programmers in the world, so of course they make for the best managers. Fortunately, they decided to test this assumption with something internal that they called Project Oxygen. And through Project Oxygen, they analyzed tens of thousands of data points from things like performance reviews, exit interviews, employee surveys, and the like. And they found that while technical expertise still mattered, of course, it ranked nearly last among the things that mattered most. You see, the other more important skills were things like communication, things like caring about employees and their well-being. They wanted all of these qualities that Fred taught so well, these very human qualities that cannot be replaced by machines. And you know this. When we help kids to develop these qualities, not only are we giving them the tools to succeed in their professional lives someday, we're also giving them the tools to discover themselves, to discover what intrigues them, what moves them, what bothers them, what brings them joy. You see, Fred's tools have been shown to boost academics, health, and mental well-being. They're 10 times more predictive of long-term success than any test scores we can give. And you know they cost almost nothing to develop, and they hinge on the very things that make life worth living: self-acceptance, close, loving relationship, and a deep regard for our neighbors. So in our book, Ryan and I focus each chapter on one of these tools for learning. So Ryan, let's dig into these tools.
First one is curiosity. So in 2007, a psychologist named Michelle Chenard published a really interesting study. Chenard and her colleagues recorded 4 children from the time they were 14 months old until they were just older than 5. They were trying to figure out, what is it the kids do when they're left to their own devices? What do they talk about? And so they collected 230 hours of recorded conversation from these kids. And even though their sample size was small, just 4 children, what they found was revealing. These 4 kids, when left to their own devices, did one particular thing. And any of you who've ever spent time with little kids can probably guess what that one thing was. They asked questions. These kids asked a lot of questions. They asked, on average, more than 100 questions an hour. So suffice it to say that kids are curious, right? Kids are inherently curious. The world is a big, beautiful, messy, dirty, dangerous place, and they want to know how it all works. And we know from modern learning science that the more curious kids are, the more their learning sticks. Susan Engel is one of the world's leading experts on this, and she says that inciting children's curiosity is the best way to ensure that they'll absorb and retain information. So you'd think that as adults, as educators, as practitioners, we would make inciting that curiosity our top priority. But as you probably remember from your own time as a student, that's not always the case. In fact, when Engel herself went out into the field to study this is what she found. In kindergarten, in any given 2-hour stretch, they saw anywhere from 2 to 5 questions. In 5th grade classrooms, a typical 2-hour stretch of time often didn't yield 1 student question. So that's 2 hours in a classroom with no questions, when we know that some kids, at least under the right conditions, would ask upwards of 100 questions an hour. So how do we bridge that gap? How do we tap and nurture the natural curiosity that children bring to us? Well, fortunately, Fred left us some blueprints. One of the most important things he learned from his mentor, Margaret McFarland, was the Quaker philosophy, that attitudes are caught, not taught. Fred knew how important it was to model curiosity himself. So if you watch basically any episode of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, you'll find him talking about how many questions he has. You find him telling viewers how much he wants to know about the world. And you'll find him singing songs like, did you know? Did you know when you wonder, you're learning? Fred knew how important it was to show learners that he's a learner too. And this is why. It's what you bring to the children every day, he said, that encourages and inspires children to ask questions and to be imaginative. Now, while researching our book, one of the people we spoke to was Hedda Sharafin, who is sort of a superstar learning scientist in her own right. She was also a producer in Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, working with Fred all the way back from the first day of production in the late 1960s. And Hedda gave us the example of an Ask It basket. And I think, Greg, did I see you reaching for a prop?
I did, but I put the wicker basket over there. So let me tell you what Hedda shared with us. She visited a classroom and she noticed that there was a very large wicker basket in the front of the classroom. And she thought, well, that's curious. What's that for? She sat in the back of the classroom, watched the instruction unfold. And what she noticed about this classroom is that kids were asking lots of questions. I love to think that this is a classroom full of older students. And what the teacher did was took the time to notice the question was being asked, acknowledged it. If it was directly on point with the instruction, of course, answered in that moment. But for the most part, was taking time to write it down, putting it in the Ask It basket, as she called it, and said, together later, we're going to wonder about the answer or answers to your question. It was the sort of thing that let kids know that they belonged in that space, that their questions were respected, and it was okay, whatever it was that they were thinking or feeling in that moment. So powerful to support their curiosity. And here's a modern example of that. We have so many Harry Potter-like wizards over at Carnegie Mellon University, right here in our backyard, like you have at the University of San Diego. And those wizards at CMU created something called Message for Me a number of years ago. Simple process of utilizing tools like digital cameras, connecting those digital cameras to voice recordings that then allowed a teacher to send SMS technology messages to a parent or caregiver. The whole point of which was to facilitate conversation between adult and child, such that at the end of the day, when, say, this daughter's dad was coming to pick her up, he didn't say, like, what did you do at school today? But rather had an opportunity to ask a specific and yet open-ended question like, I noticed that you were looking at the blue fish in the tank. Tell me more about that. Why did that interest you? A wonderful way to facilitate curiosity and to affirm its importance.
Yeah, I mean, what all this stuff does is show kids that their questions have value. It shows them that it's okay to wonder. Fred knew that kids have to know that. And kids have to know what's out there to wonder about. Fred knew that it's hard for humans to be curious about things that are completely unfamiliar to them. And so that's why when Fred took us someplace new, he always started with something that was familiar. He started with a fish tank, or he started with a sandbox, or sometimes he started with a crayon. He always started with something familiar enough to help kids form questions, because when kids start to form questions, they can then generate new ideas, which takes us to our next lesson.
Fred protected our creativity. So some years ago, George Land tested the creativity of 1,005-year-olds using a test he developed for NASA, our space agency. And he found that 98% of those kids scored so highly that they qualified as creative geniuses. As with curiosity, kids are naturally creative. And you know this, they make up stories and songs, they draw pictures, they develop unusual solutions to the problems in their own lives. Now, George Land and his team also discovered something else, because they tested that same group of 5-year-olds every few years. At 10 years old, the share of creative geniuses fell from 98% to 30%. At 15 years old, the share fell to 12%. By adulthood, it fell to 2%, from 98% to 2%. Now, what Land and his team concluded was not that creativity naturally fades with age, but that non-creative behavior is learned. And Fred himself talked about this. What happens if children hear that their mud pies are no good and their block buildings have no importance? So how is it that we grown-ups protect and nurture the creativity that kids are naturally born with? How do we help them counter the non-creative behaviors that they're inevitably going to learn? Well, in the neighborhood, it began with adults. And every day we saw Fred engage in a creative pursuit that some of us maybe considered childish. You know, he was cutting with construction paper and putting popsicle sticks together. Whatever it was he was doing, he made it clear that it was bringing him great joy. And it wasn't just Fred. It was the people we met in the neighborhood, like Wynton Marsalis, Yo-Yo Ma, and Julia Child. But more often than not, it was the everyday people in the neighborhood. How many of you remember Officer Clemens? Also the neighborhood opera singer. Handyman Negri, also the neighborhood guitarist. You see, all of these guest stars and all of these characters show that creativity wasn't just for kids, that we don't have to give up our creative pursuits that enrich our lives as we get older. Importantly, as Fred said, the best teacher in the world is the one who loves what he or she does and loves it right in front of you. Here's a beautiful example from a science teacher at a school district right outside of Pittsburgh. This is a science teacher who loves theme parks and video games, and one day looked around his very typical classroom and said, what might this be? He brought the joy of his love of theme parks and video games to recreate a classroom in a way that looks expensive, but absolutely wasn't. And you could imagine what this teacher does in this space in teaching biology and other science modules in a space that's bringing him great joy. It brings him joy, it brings his students joy, it oozes in extraordinary ways. It's an example of showing kids potential, that we each have agency and that the world is a place of possibilities.
Next lesson is that Fred modeled communication. Because if there is one thing that set Fred Rogers apart from your average caring adult, it was the thoughtfulness and the intention with which he spoke to children. And in our book, we describe Fred's approach to communication by borrowing a concept from Thich Nhat Hanh, who is the Buddhist monk and philosopher. He died just a few months ago at the age of 95. Thich Nhat Hanh breaks effective communication down to two components: deep listening and loving speech. I'm going to start with deep listening, because deep listening does one particular thing. It acknowledges and respects the feelings of a child, even if we don't agree with those feelings. Now, of course, that's way easier said than done, because kids sometimes have these feelings that are just downright baffling to the rest of us, right? They don't make sense. We don't understand how they could possibly feel that way given the situation. But when we make space to listen to those big, baffling feelings anyway, and when we do so without judging them, without injecting our assumptions or our experiences or even our well-intentioned words of wisdom, we start to do what Fred did, which is make those big, baffling feelings mentionable. And as Fred liked to say, anything that's mentionable becomes more manageable. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't correct kids, and it doesn't mean that we never explain our own position or our own feelings. It only means that, at least at first, it's helpful to try to listen to kids uncritically. Being supportive, Fred said, often means waiting, listening, and more waiting until you're better able to understand the drama that a certain child is living through at the moment. Now, once we've done that waiting, and once we've done that listening, it's also our job to speak to children lovingly. And a great tool for thinking about how to do that was created by the Fred Rogers Institute, right outside of Pittsburgh in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, where Fred was born and grew up. This is the simple interactions tool. And basically what it is a rubric for thinking about how our interactions with children, or really with anyone, convey the sense of love and support the children need to thrive. There are teachers and parents and principals and school administrators across the country, across the world, using this tool to recognize moments of loving speech, those moments which we communicate our presence and inclusion and support. So basically, the Simple Interactions team shows up. They film 5 or 10 minutes of just everyday simple interactions between kids and their caregivers. And then the caregivers watch those videos together, thinking about how am I empowering, encouraging, and enriching human relationships in the ways in which I'm speaking and communicating with children. I'm going to drop a link to what this looks like in practice in the chat box. And Greg, we are down to about 5 minutes. So let's see. I think we can go to the next lesson.
Our 10th lesson. And you know this, Fred showed us how neighbors work together. 9 out of 10 of us in all sorts of ways in work have to work together. And you know how hard that comes at work, to say nothing of what we experience in our communities or maybe even in our own households. Now, fortunately, we find some solutions in Fred's work. And there was a psychologist named Lynette Frieder-Kofer who did extensive studies of the neighborhood and tried to understand what was happening in the neighborhood. And in one of her pieces, she wrote this: in the neighborhood, what is common to each situation is the careful progression and clarification of ideas and feelings that includes all participants. In other words, problems get solved when everyone feels safe, everyone feels seen, and everyone, regardless of background, feels respected enough to be able to speak their minds. And learning science has shown this sense of psychological safety and mutual respect is what powers effective collaboration. So how is it that we create environments like these in which kids can learn to work together? Well, one of the ways that we can do that is to give them opportunities to practice. And in the course of our research, one of the places we visited was the Girls of Steel. It's an all-girls high school robotics team, girls coming from many different high schools across the Pittsburgh region. They don't have relationships as they enter this team together. And what their coaches do is extraordinary because they practice teamwork. You see, the girls' coaches take these fictional scenarios drawn from real-life situations that the girls are dealing with. And they spend time as a team discussing how they might hypothetically handle them. And you could imagine in the process, they practice interpersonal conflict, they practice perspective taking, and they recognize all sorts of differences en route to their common solutions. But by talking about this stuff in a fictionalized, judgment-free way, they start to develop the psychological safety that lets them function individually and as a team in the real world of robotics competitions. Another great example of this is the small lab technology. Some of you have maybe seen classrooms like this. Teachers taking subject matter from a more traditional classroom, maybe predicates or fractions, and through the small lab technology of gaming software projected onto a classroom floor, kids having to work together to solve subject matter problems. But in the process, they're practicing that teamwork and collaboration.
Thank you. Hey, Greg, let's skip straight to lesson 12, just for the sake of time.
Oh my goodness, we're gonna skip right to lesson 12. So this is my favorite one. So Fred showed us the importance of our worth and why that's so critically important. So back in the 1970s, Hallmark, the greeting card company, invited some celebrities to design holiday displays for their Manhattan store. And one display you can imagine was noticeably different. It was a single pine tree about the height of a child, encased in clear acrylic. It had no lights, no tinsel, no ornaments, nothing fancy. It didn't even say who designed it. It only had a plaque that said this. Now, of course, you know who the designer was. If there was one message at the core of Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, it was this: I like you just the way you are. And though we don't always think about feeling accepted as a basic human need, those feelings matter as much as food and water do. Now, there are all sorts of interesting studies from the learning sciences about this, and I'll share briefly just one that comes from this century. You see, a group of researchers gave some college students a fake personality test and then assigned them to one of 3 different groups based on their supposed results. Now, they told the first group, you're going to have rewarding, caring relationships in your household and your neighborhood throughout life. Life is going to be beautiful. They told a second group, your friendships are going to fade, your marriage might end, and you're likely to spend your life alone. And then they told a third group, I'm worried for you. You seem to be incredibly accident prone. Dangers ahead for you. Car accidents, falling downstairs. Life is going to be incredibly rough. And then they gave each of these groups an IQ test. The only group that bombed that test, it wasn't the third group, it was that second group. You see, it wasn't bad news that caused the students to freeze, but rather that second prospect of social exclusion. You see, when confronted with this horrific idea of spending their lives alone, unconnected, students lost the ability to think, to reason clearly, to learn. Now, fortunately, the researchers apologized afterwards, as they should have, and assured the group that it had all been a ruse. But the study underscores the importance of Fred's message of radical acceptance. He knew that we all needed the same thing. We need to know that we're worth being proud of. Kids and adults need to know that they matter to the people around them, that they're worth being proud of. And of course, we can show this to them in lots of ways, by telling them, of course, but also by deploying all of the tools that Fred Rogers taught us, by nurturing their curiosity, by protecting their creativity, by listening deeply and speaking lovingly, by building those psychologically safe spaces and seeing their promise and believing in their potential. Now, showing kids that we like them just the way they are doesn't mean that we tell them they're perfect or that everything that they do and say is good or even okay. But it does mean this. It means that we refuse to reject their humanity. Fred used to say that love is an active noun. Love is an active noun like struggle, that to love someone is to struggle to accept them exactly as he or she is right now. And that's not always easy, but as adults, it is the most important gift that we can give to our young people.
Let's skip to lesson 14, our last lesson. This is a quote of Fred's, and really there's not much else we can say to add to it, except to try to add a little bit of love to the world ourselves. And Fred, when he spoke, he used to do this exercise that Greg and I think sums up everything Fred did, sums up everything Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood was about. We're not going to have time to do it together, but I do want to read it to you word for word, just so you can hear what Fred was doing for folks. From the time you were very little, he used to say, you've had people who have smiled you into smiling, people who have talked you into talking, sung you into singing, loved you into loving. Some of them may be here right now. Some may be far away. Some may even be in heaven. But wherever they are, if they've loved you and encouraged you and wanted what is best in life for you, then they're right inside yourself. And I feel that you deserve some quiet time on this special occasion to devote some thought to them. So let's just take a minute in honor of those who have cared about us all along the way. And I hope you all find time later today for your one silent minute.
And as we close the presentation portion, I hope you'll give yourself space and time to think about those people. Because lesson 14.3 is to add a little bit of love to this world. You see, around the turn of the millennium, Fred issued us all this challenge. Try your best to make goodness attractive, he said. That's one of the toughest assignments you'll ever be given. And Fred was right, it is tough. It is easier to tear down than it is to build. It is easier to fear than it is to love. But if we want to do more than just prepare future workers, if we want every child to have the freedom to discover her potential, if we want to raise creative, curious, caring kids, if we want to build stronger, more inclusive communities and a more just and loving world, then making goodness attractive is what we must do. And whomever it is that you've been thinking about during this time, whether it's a parent, teacher, a friend, maybe even Fred Rogers himself, he or she is proof that making goodness attractive is possible. So we have to ask ourselves, how will we do the same for our kids, everyone? Thank you. What a joy it is to be with you all.
Thank you all. I think we have about 10 minutes for questions, if there are any. Feel free to use the chat. Feel free to come off mute. I see a question from Edwina. How does this apply to other children's shows? This is the only content analysis you conducted. Do you notice shows that do the opposite? A couple of things. Yes, we notice plenty of shows that do the opposite. But I will say that Fred Rogers Productions, which is the nonprofit that Fred started to produce The Neighborhood, is now the single largest producer of children's content in the world. Daniel Tiger, which is the animated spinoff of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, is streamed something like 40 million times a month. And what's really heartening about shows like Daniel Tiger and the other things that Fred Rogers Productions produces, things like Almost Way and Don Quixote, excuse me, is that they put the same amount of care into every scene of those programs that Fred did in the neighborhood. They have consultants making sure that the characters are accurate. The children will be able to relate them. The children will be able to see themselves in them. Fred did that for every single scene of the neighborhood for 40 years. And the fact that there are still people willing, many of whom worked with Fred himself, to put that kind of intention and work and thought into programming for children, it gives us great hope.
And Ryan and I have had the unexpected opportunity to meet with video game developers and multimedia producers and others who are producing multimedia materials for entertainment or educational purposes for young children or older children. And the numbers of people increasingly working to unpack the work of Fred Rogers and to think about how in their discipline, through their medium, they're applying that whole child sensibility to the learning sciences is profoundly uplifting. And there are people at Apple and Netflix and others who've closely studied with the Fred Rogers Institute and others to really understand that work so that they can be as deliberate and thoughtful about their work and what they're producing as Fred was. It's certainly a great aspiration for the field of children's multimedia.
Any final questions before we let you all go?
I'll ask a final question since
Sure.
we have 2 or 3 minutes left. I immediately thought about the implications of how you build a culture that supports that type of social support and interaction in schools, in the workplace, because it's not going to be, if you're working with kids, it's not just an individual teacher. It has to be lived in the culture. And are you guys doing anything towards that end, or what do you know about that end of it?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, there's this interesting study. We skipped over this lesson, but a lot of the folks on this call are probably familiar with the idea of a growth mindset, right? That your intelligence can be improved through effort. And there are some tools out there that show kids that their intelligence is malleable, that the more they work, the better they get at a specific thing. And in some cases, those tools have been shown to give kids a boost. I mean, they've been shown to boost attendance and graduation rates and things like enrollment in advanced math, things that are all really important. But the caveat there is that these things only work if the adults around kids have that same mindset. That is, like, the adults have to really believe that the kids are actually capable of learning and growing. And the adults have to convey that belief in ways that kids find authentic and trustworthy and real. And embedding that into a culture, it's difficult to do. I think we've seen a lot of great examples happen, in isolated places. But the sort of systemic adoption of this kind of thing is always going to be the challenge. Greg, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that.
I was going to say, what uplifts us is the number of schools, museums, libraries, early learning centers, and other sites of learning thinking about how do I take that Fred method and make it something real for myself, but also this organization or system of which I'm part. And there was a journalist who once asked Fred, what is this? What is it that you're creating here? And Fred actually described it as an atmosphere for learning. I love that phrase because Fred understood the importance of learning how to learn. Something that we talk about so obviously in the context of today's learning sciences, but in yet another demonstration of how Fred was decades ahead of his time in understanding and appreciating that atmosphere is critical to everything else. That sense of safety, that sense of belonging, that sense of joy. And happily, whether it's school districts through AASA's work around the Learning 2025 initiative, or the school districts involved in the League of Innovative Schools, or the museums involved in the Future of American Museums, or other sites of learning or production companies who are involved in creating all sorts of devices, software, and hardware. I think we can be uplifted and pleased that Fred Rogers and his sensibility is coming back not only in our culture, but in our professional lives.
I think so much of it comes down to permission, right? like we want kids to find their passion. We want kids to find something in their learning that brings them joy, but we don't always prioritize that or give adults permission to find the same thing, to bring something that they really deeply care about into classrooms and do this, as Gregg noted earlier, love something in front of students. That's why I love this example so much, because I think if the pandemic, is for as horrible as it's been, I think it has broken down some of those barriers to permission, and it's allowed people to try new things. It's allowed some teachers in some places to bring those passions into the classroom. And that's not only important for learning, like that's just important for the profession of education, in which we're seeing more burnout than ever before, although that's a problem that predates the pandemic. How do we help the people in charge of children's learning love learning themselves? And how do we help them love it in front of students? The more permission I think we can give them to do that, we're doing a service not only to kids, but also to teachers.
Gregg and Ryan, it's time for us to wrap up. I thank you so much for your time, for your caring message. I'm sending you both big virtual hugs.
Same to you, all the way in Greece.
Care about each other as educators and human beings. And have a great day. Your profile information is in the Whova platform if anybody wants to follow up with you. And you'll get email messaging that way. So thank you both so much. And I hope you have a great day.
Thank you so much. We hope you have a beautiful day in your neighborhood, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.